the emperor sent out investigators, and there was in fact this great vampire flap. There's a wonderful book called Vampires, Burial, and Death, published by Yale University Press, and I cannot remember the author's name, but if you look up that title and Yale University Press, you will find it. It'll also tell you everything you ever wanted to know about how corpses decay. The title is Vampires, Burial, and Death. It will tell you a great deal about these. It's a scientific book. It's written by one of the people who's on the...
Quick tangent about most of these things were in French. In the 19th century, respectable English people all knew French. The upper classes all learned French, so they could read the stuff that was too sexy or violent or whatever to be published in English.
And also, it was a language of diplomacy. Thus, for example, if the Habsburgs have to talk to the Romanovs, what language do they use? And the answer is French.
Right.
French was the language of the Russian court, for instance.
But there's all this stuff that was published in French for up until the 1920s in English. Anytime you wanted to say something you thought was too racy, you said it in French. This turns up in as late as Dorothy Sayers or Grizzly Stories.
Right. And that's what I French.
But the real point here is what this means is that only the upper classes, who were, of course, too sophisticated to be polluted by this stuff, would actually get to read all the sex and violence. The lower classes who didn't know French didn't.
Well, these were basically nonfiction, and basically they concluded some of the inspectors were concerned. They thought it was just a bunch of superstitious peasants digging up corpses. There was no question they were digging up corpses and driving stakes through their hearts, and that kind of stuff. It was definitely going on. Mm-hmm. The question is, was anything supernatural going on? Opinions were divided. It was because, among other things, there are circumstances under which you can dig up a corpse and it will look just like you hear in the vampire stories. It will look totally undecayed and bloated. There are circumstances under which you can drive a stake through its heart and it will issue a cry, which is, of course, gas coming out. There are circumstances in which, when you do that, blood will spurt out, even though it's been buried for weeks. So a good deal of the phenomena that were actually being reported were physically quite real. And needless to say, superstition ran amok, and the equivalent of the yellow journalism of the period ran amok. And if they had tabloid newspapers, you can just imagine. And meanwhile, the Habsburg government's trying to puzzle out what shall be done about this, and it created this sensation. What we don't get nowadays very much is say what was the sort of trash journalism of the 1730s and 40s like? Well, that was a good deal of it. They were also busy inventing Sawney being the Scottish cannibal in those days.
Oh, yes.
Who was also the product of the yellow journalism of the period.
The Newgate calendar it started out as just a list of who was hanged to do the prison that month.
It was much more fun than that.
Yeah.
But they started adding details of their crimes. And then they started doing historical stuff about other criminals who were hanged to do it, or maybe other prisons. And these got more and more lurid and less connected to reality. And basically, it was, I don't know, are any of you ever seen like True Detective magazine?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they were doing. They were doing stuff like True Detective, but even less fact-checking.
Even less fact-checking. There was lots of lurid woodcuts and copy printing and illiterate writing.
And one of their favorite stories was Sawney Bean, the Scottish cannibal. And this was taken for fact for 100 years until somebody finally pointed out that the historical records from that period don't actually match the story.
I got to actually check that out in some detail and wrote an article about it. And then it turned out somebody else had written a whole book about it. But basically, Lee Weinstein challenged me and he said, well, if this is so well recorded in history, where? And then we started to try to find out. And, basically, we are like, the basic story of Sawney Bean is this family of cannibals in Scotland has been waylaying travelers and eating them. And raised an entire family, living in a cave in the coast, they raised an entire family of cannibals. And since they ate everybody they met, no one ever knew about this for quite a while. Until finally, somebody got away, and the king himself, with armed knights, came and supposedly fought their way into the cave, captured hundreds of cannibals, took them back to, dozens of cannibals, including lots of children, and they took them all back to Edinburgh for edifying, gory executions.
No, Lee. It wasn't Edinburgh, it was Lee.
You don't know which version of the story you got.
It was Lee.
Considering that it's not true, the story was drift. It also...
Okay, every version I ever saw that even pretended accuracy said it was Lee.
Pretending? But now the question is, which king? Now,
James I.
Basically, we found it attached to both James I and James I of England, who would be James VI of Scotland.
I'm sorry, I meant James I of England. Yes.
Now, the problem with James I of England is that the indelicate comment is basically virtually every time he farted it was recorded. His life is so well documented that if anything so lurid and sensational had happened, Surely there would be some records, and there aren't. And it turns out that this entire thing was in fact made up as a derogatory term against Scotsmen about the time of the Jacobite risings in the early 18th century, to show that the Scots were wild, degenerate savages. Turns out the name Sawney is a derogatory term, rather like contemporary racist derogatory terms, aimed at Scotsmen.
Right.
And about 1800, after all the political ruckus was over, the Scots decided they liked this story and took it to their own. And now any tour guide in Edinburgh will tell you.
You could teach it to tourists. You could sell all kinds of stuff.
But it originally was entirely
I have this chip of Gobia from Sawney Bean's own cave.
The story also drifted into Ireland a little bit. We basically found that no matter what you try to pin this down, it starts to move. This is how you usually tell something is folklore. Is when you start to go through the details, it starts to move around. It's applied to more than one person in more than one place.
Urban legend.
Well, it's something like that. And basically, they couldn't decide on what king. There was about a 140-year window of kings, and there was a substantial geographical drift. And by the way, the mathematics don't make any sense.
No, they really don't.
Well,
I mean, according to the stories, you're looking at a body count of over 1,000 people, and that would have been noticed before.
What they also would have noticed was that the Sawney Bean
You're
time,
English.
the Sawney Bean time would have largely been a large cannibal nursery, because you have to figure out how long would it take Mrs. Bean to have so many children and then have so many grandchildren, and basically you started working it out from the approximate ages and so on, and to have as many as you said there, most of them be like 6.
Yeah. But actually, the story has most of them were about 6 to 8.
yes.